The Levant Mine, also known as the Mine Under the Sea, began operations in 1820. It eventually burrowed 2,000 feet into the earth and a full mile beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The potential for disaster, should a tunnel fail, was immense. However, the conditions within the mine itself were already incredibly dangerous, culminating in the tragic Levant Mine Disaster. In contrast to today's work environment, where stress often stems from exhaustion or emotional strain, jobs a couple of centuries ago frequently posed a direct threat to life. While advancements in safety technology and training have contributed to improvements, legislative action has been the most significant driver of change. The threat of legal repercussions has proven far more effective in compelling businesses to invest in and enforce safety measures. Mining, historically and even today, is a hazardous occupation. Modern advancements like electricity, forced airflow, hydraulic motors, and geological testing tools have made it significantly safer. However, miners centuries ago lacked these advantages. The Levant Mine, located on the southwestern tip of England, opened in 1820. Primarily a copper mine, it also yielded tin and small amounts of arsenic. Copper and tin were becoming increasingly valuable for brass and bronze production. However, the miners faced appalling conditions. Reaching 600 meters, 2,000 feet below the surface, the Levant Mine was pitch black and extremely hot. Parts of it extended horizontally a full mile under the Atlantic Ocean, tempting fate. One shaft, known as 40 Backs, was only 12 meters, 40 feet from the seabed. A tunnel breach would have resulted in catastrophic flooding, trapping the miners below. Even without the constant threat of drowning, the mine was a harsh environment. Temperatures could exceed 40 degrees Celsius, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Many miners worked nearly naked to avoid heat stroke. Some even forewent boots, which would become soaked with sweat, risking trench foot. In the complete darkness, miners relied on candles for illumination. Before entering the mine, they collected clay from a surface pile to affix candles to their heads, or later, their helmets. With both hands needed for work and climbing, lanterns were impractical, and illuminating the vast mine with fixed lights was infeasible. This method, while unusual, was the only viable solution. However, it created new problems. Candles frequently extinguished and needed relighting using matches carried in waterproof brass containers. Each day, hundreds of men descended into the mine via shafts containing 80 ladders. Once underground, they used hand drills to create half-meter deep channels in the rock for gunpowder. After setting a fuse and clearing the area, they waited for the explosion to break the stone. They then cleared the debris by hand. More delicate work was done entirely by hand. Other teams followed, reinforcing the passageways with logs and planks. This process was repeated continuously. Hundreds of tons of stone and ore had to be transported kilometers back to the main shafts daily, using hundreds of small mine carts pulled by horses and mules adapted to underground work. Adding to the grueling conditions, miners had to climb back up the 80 ladders at the end of their shifts. This climb could take up to 90 minutes from the deepest levels, and this climb was unpaid time. They were only paid for the time spent working their 3 8-hour shifts, excluding Sundays. Despite these horrific conditions, the Levant Mine employed between 300 and 700 people annually, about 2/3 underground. The surface workers, including women, children, and men with injuries, broke up the ore into fist-sized pieces and sorted it. Underground workers could be as young as 14. Many were desperate for work. Falls from the ladders were common, and loose gunpowder ignited by candles caused numerous injuries, including blindness and premature explosions. Unconscious or seriously injured miners were hauled up using ropes or, later, skips, pairs of buckets in a dedicated shaft. By 1840, engines were becoming more common and were used to power these skips. The two buckets moved along vertical tracks in a shaft, connected by a cable over a pulley. This system required the steam engine only to lift the ore, as the buckets counterbalanced each other. In 1857, a new system for transporting workers was introduced, the man engine. This was a vertical conveyor belt with platforms. A wooden rod was inserted into the shaft with platforms and handlebars every 12 feet. An engine at the surface lifted and lowered the rod 12 feet at a time. Miners stepped onto a descending platform, were raised, stepped onto a stationary platform, and repeated the process to reach the surface from the bottom. While seemingly insane, the MAN engine was a significant improvement over climbing 80 ladders, reducing the ascent time from 90 minutes to 30 and improving safety for exhausted miners. It even reduced rates of lung and heart issues and extended average lifespans for workers in mines that used them. The engine, through a series of gears, could move the 24-ton rod with only 30 pounds of steam pressure per square inch. However, by the 1850s, modern elevators were emerging, and the Levant Mine engine was relatively primitive, using only one moving rod instead of two, doubling the travel time. It also used a choppy, unreliable engine, later replaced in 1893. Despite this, it remained in use for almost 30 more years. By 1919, 62 years of constant use had taken its toll. On October 20th, during the afternoon shift, miners were returning to the surface. Many had just survived World War I, only to face a struggling economy. They had repeatedly warned management about the MAN engine's unsafe condition, but nothing was done. Replacing the engine was considered too expensive, and plans for a new shaft and modern system were yet to begin. The mine employed 331 people, 187 underground. As men crowded onto the platforms just 18 feet from the top of the stroke, a bracket connecting the top beams to the rod, which had been deteriorating for 5 years, broke. The rod and the men on it began to fall. Near the top of the shaft, the men plummeted downwards. The falling rod bent and broke through the safety catch wings. The top 300 feet of the rod broke off and continued to fall, hitting men further down. Workers below heard the crashing and felt the platforms shaking. Some jumped onto ledges, others clung on as they slid down into the darkness. Their candles were extinguished, and the shaft filled with the sounds of crashing rock as the rod buckled and caused a partial cave-in. Silence followed, then the cries of trapped men. The 300-foot piece of rod fell further, blocking the tunnel. The rest of the rod buckled, trapping men deep underground. At the surface, workers knew something was wrong. John Grenfell volunteered to descend into the shaft. He immediately found dead and injured men trapped among the debris. His father, a site manager, was among the missing. News of the disaster spread, and off-duty miners and rescuers from nearby mines arrived. The rescue effort was grueling. Rescuers were winched down on ropes, clearing debris while trying to avoid further collapses. Trapped miners below regrouped as best they could. Some used remaining emergency ladders to move around. They gathered at the skip shaft and water pumping shaft, which also had emergency ladders to the surface. 2 hours after the collapse, survivors began emerging, shocking and relieving the rescuers. Exhausted as they were, they joined the rescue effort. Over 50 men were still missing. It took 3 days of digging to rescue all the survivors. Sadly, 31 men died. 14 were found near the top of the debris pile, most between 160 and 320 feet deep, and the final 3 at 420, 480, and 660 feet killed by falling debris. Among the survivors was 14-year-old William Lowry, trapped for 15 hours beneath another miner. He was the first rescued with a snapped collarbone, broken ribs, and 36 stitches. Another man, Nicholas Thomas, survived for 50 hours but died from exhaustion after being rescued. 5 of the deceased had survived World War I. 19 miners suffered serious injuries. Ralph Ellis, a World War I veteran whose foster father was killed, was deeply affected. He suffered a breakdown the following year after another minor accident at the mine. An investigation found the broken bracket was improperly made with internal faults, leading to the controversial designation of the event as an accident, absolving the owners of liability despite the Levant being the only mine in Cornwall still using a MAN engine. This left the families without compensation. A disaster fund was established, raising £15,000. Donations poured in, and an anonymous poem about the disaster was sold to raise funds. However, this was insufficient to fully compensate the victims' families. The mine continued operating until 1930, but never fully recovered. The post-war economy and the Great Depression made it impossible to replace the MAN engine. In 1967, the mine's beam engine was entrusted to the National Trust. The Levant mine remains open to the public as a historical site, but the underground portion is permanently sealed.